Hello students and welcome back. I'm Professor Fernetovich and this is part 2 of chapter 1. In the part 1 lecture video, I talked about the properties of living things. What does it mean to be alive? And we left off with the last one where we were talking about evolution, how evolution is a change in a population over time. And in talking about populations, we talked about how they are a group of individuals of the same species in a given area. So what's a species? Well, a species is a group of organisms that share traits and share a gene pool and can interbreed. Sometimes I talk about it as a type of organism or type or species. I use interchangeably sometimes, but species is collectively a group that can interbreed, that shares certain genes and can make productive offspring. In talking about evolution, we can't miss Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a scientist and a very curious man, and in the 1800s, he took a trip on a ship, the Beagle, and sailed to the Galapagos Islands where he observed many different species, types of organisms, and saw how they interacted and saw how they possibly were related to one another by evolution. He saw that there were islands that were separate, and the farther apart the islands were, the more different the species were. The closer together the islands were, the more similarities those organisms had. So that's summarizing it just a little bit. Now, sometimes people say evolution, it's just a theory. But theory in science means something very different than it means in everyday language. In our everyday language, a theory is just like an idea, just a guess. But in science, a theory is a strong and widely accepted explanation for a phenomenon. It's something that has been studied and gone through the scientific process enough that we have so much evidence for it. So the scientific method is something we'll also be looking at in lab. It starts with observations of natural phenomena. Scientists will make a hypothesis as a best guess to explain this phenomenon. So a hypothesis is kind of like a colloquial theory. Scientists can often make predictions, although that one we do not talk about in the lab of Bio 107. They predict an outcome. The experiment helps to set up the hypothesis where you would collect data. Data is often quantitative in the sciences. That means it's made up of numbers, but it can also be qualitative, showing the quality of things. The results from the experiment can lead us to a conclusion. And when repeated by peers and the same conclusion occurs over and over again, we have a theory. And when we do this so much that we can never find an exception to our theory, then we have a scientific law. There aren't many laws in biology because of all the variation that we have with living things. But we will see certain laws of probability coming into the biology end of things when we get into genetics and inheritance patterns. Okay. We see laws more commonly in chemistry because chemicals and elements are predictable, and in physics, the law of gravity is something that we really can't debate. They started out as theories too. So I want to look at some different organisms, some different species here. We're going to be focusing on the cell in this course, but it is fun to put some context to that. So organisms are made up of cells, and scientists classify organisms, okay, based on certain traits, also based on genes. And organisms are classified with classification by being put in groups, from very general groups to very specific groups. That's how I like to go, from the very general to the very specific. And so when we look out at all the broad diversity on the planet Earth, we're looking at millions of species. So first, scientists group them into three very big categories called domains. And the domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Okay. Bacteria are single-celled organisms. Archaea are as well. They have some differences. And eukarya are organisms that have a nucleus. And some eukaryas are single-celled, but mostly they are multi-celled. Okay, now I do want to point out that this is our current classification. It does change, and back when I learned biology in high school a long time ago, we didn't discuss domains. The highest level of organization, the most general level, was the kingdom. Okay, but that has changed. We now have something bigger than kingdom for grouping. This little tree is a simple tree of life, and it shows those three domains. Down here at the base of the tree is the common ancestor of life. Think of this as the first living organism. And there is evidence that the first living organism was a blue-green bacteria. And so we can see that the bacteria branch is coming off first. It's thought that they are the oldest organisms on the planet. Then archaea and eukarya. This has more of the familiar organisms in it, and we are in the domain eukarya. Okay, so really simply, I want to just run through what these things are. Bacteria are microscopic unicellular prokaryotes. What does that mean? Microscopic means it's very small. We can't see it with the naked eye. Okay, these are tiny, single-celled organisms. Unicellular means single-celled. And prokaryote means it's a type of organism without a membrane-bound nucleus. Okay, so all of the genetic material and all the cellular contents are just floating inside the cell, inside each bacterium. Okay. So this is one bacterium, this is one individual. Just like you are an individual, this is one bacterium individual. This is a picture of Escherichia coli, E. coli. It's actually our most common digestive bacteria. And it has a really bad rap because there are some mutations and some mutants of it that can cause real serious problems. But there's thousands of species of bacteria out there. Some are beneficial, some are harmful. A lot of them are neither. That's to us, by the way. Archaea are similar to bacteria, but when we look at the genetics of archaea, we can see that they are different enough from bacteria to warrant their own category. So these are unicellular prokaryotes. They tend to live in extreme environments. And again, their genes are very different than the bacteria. This is a clump of archaea, and each one is here. I should point out, too, that the shapes of bacteria and archaea can vary. Even though they're single-celled organisms, they can come in spiral shapes. They can come in blobs like this. They can look like capsules. There are many different shapes. And finally, the domain eukarya. This picture might make you feel a little more comfort because we can recognize some of these organisms. Okay. We have our mushrooms and plants and animals and what, protists? Well, these are the three kingdoms that we have in this domain. Protists are organisms that have a nucleus, membrane around the nucleus, so they're not prokaryotes. We call them eukaryotes. And they don't quite fit in with these other ones. So fungi, plants, animals, and this little kind of wacky kingdom, the protist kingdom. So this domain is classified and categorized because these organisms all have a nucleus, which is a compartment that contains the genetic material. And the four kingdoms, like I said, are protists. Some are unicellular, some are multicellular. It's the only kingdom that has unicellular eukaryotes. Plants generally do photosynthesis. They're all multicellular. Animals ingest food. They're all multicellular. Fungi absorb nutrients. And they are mostly multicellular with some exceptions, some single-celled organisms. So you can see these are classified by how they obtain nutrition, their energy. Except protists. Protists are everything that doesn't fit into these three categories. Okay, so domain is the biggest category. Then we have kingdom. And you might be wondering right now, there are four kingdoms in eukarya, that domain. But what about the domain of bacteria? What about the domain of archaea? Well, they have about 12 kingdoms each. Their classification is changing more rapidly than the eukaryotic domain classification because we have so much technology that can show us genetic differences more strongly than ever before. So those kingdoms are in flux somewhat. Then we have phylum. Each kingdom is broken down into different phyla. Each phylum is broken into a class. Classes are broken up into orders, to families, genus, and species. And so each of these categories gets more and more specific as we get down until we end up with one group of organisms that can interbreed together. This illustration shows it with animals. And so here, actually, we're focusing on the bear, but we have all different types of organisms in the domain Eukarya. Then we look at the animal kingdom, the phylum of Chordata, the chordates, those with a backbone or spinal cord, mammals, carnivores, bears, more specific bears, and then we get to the species Ursus americanus, American black bear. Okay, so if we wanted to look at the daffodil, this next kingdom would be the plant kingdom, and then we would look at the different categories or classifications for that plant. A good way to remember this is, did King Philip come over for good sandwiches? This chart shows some basic differences between eukaryotes on the left and prokaryotes on the right. You can pause and take a look at this if you'd like. And that is where I'm going to end. Now, please read through chapter 1, look at our Moodle page, do everything on the Moodle page. It's a lot, but many of the activities are fairly short. And please never hesitate to email me questions. I am more than happy to help you anytime.